Hello again, and thanks for joining me for this. I think it'll be probably our third, maybe our fourth, the Leaders Club letter from the United States of America, or what I like to call a dispatch, if you will. And it's, again, as part of our transatlantic relationship, our attempt to mine the transatlantic gap and to build bridges between this side of the pond, the United States of America, and the UK. And the UK is that gateway into Europe proper and through the transatlantic relationship. Now, what I want to do today is I want to take on a bit of a different and maybe even a peculiar task in this particular dispatch. Well, we are again at one of those moments of war, regardless of whether and the degree to which we're debating on whether what we're engaged in right now, the United States of America, Israel, in and with and against the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'll call it, I'll show my cards and I'll just call it what I believe it is from, over 3 decades of studying, planning for, practicing, and helping to lead these things. I'll call it the war that it actually is. But we can have that conversation another time. And in fact, future letters and dispatches from this side of the pond to address that as well. We're going to actually address it a little bit today because I want to grapple with in a unique way. I want to provide a foresighting and a bit of a forecasting approach to this question that always comes up in a curious way, frankly, oftentimes, at least for me, personally and professionally, in a frustrating way. This question that was posed the last time formally and officially, as far as it was written down in a historical document by the great historian Rick Atkinson when he was in Iraq with then Major General Dave Petraeus in the 101st Airborne Division. That happened to also be my second tour of duty in Iraq as well. The book itself you can pick up and read if you haven't done so already. It's called In the Company of Soldiers. And at some point, I won't belabor and take the risk of getting the story wrong. But at some point, when Dr. Rick Atchison was having a walkabout with General Petraeus. At some point in some context, General Petraeus raised the question, uh, tell me how this ends. Tell me how this ends. Now, this was very early on, I think in the May, June timeframe of 2003, after the March Up Country phases of that war, very successful, textbook successful, actually. But already by May, June of 2003, we're getting into this curious zone of transition, to put it kindly, because we were now starting to see and deal with the lack of a finishing, even though we had already declared at that point by the 1st of May of 2003, actually, quote unquote, mission accomplished. So, this notion, this haunting question, this seminal question, frankly, tell me how this ends, tell us how this ends. We're at another one of those moments where we're even having a difficulty again of defining what exactly this thing is that has been begun, to put it in passive voice, to put it more pointedly, that the United States and Israel initiated somewhere between a conflict, as our own president's calling it, an excursion, a military combat operation. Again, I call it a war, and I'll even go further, and I'll call it a compound war. So what I want to do is I want to take on this puzzle. And I want to present it to you in a curious way. I want to give a my own foresight, and I'm going to bring some to bear some utility of forecasting and foresighting tools of inquiry to really, as I like to try to do as best as I can, tell a story, some stories within a story, and kind of walk us through and maybe towards an answer, at least the doorway towards answers to this perplexing question of telling us how this ends. I want to subtitle this letter, "Seeing and Understanding the Paradox in the American and more broadly, the Western Way of War through what I'll call the lens of the Iran compound war." So I've just about shown all my cards. I've told you all before. I'm a terrible, terrible poker player. I always show my cards face out to the competitors. So uh, forgive the stumbling around. I'm going to try to have some background pictorials here as well. I'm gonna try to walk us through this and tell a bit of a story. I want to begin actually in a bit of a personal professional story tell. And that beginning is not with Iran, actually, but with a question I've been asked more times than I can count, from briefing rooms and classrooms, and sometimes late at night in war zones, right? And early in the days, that zero dark 30 time period. The question's simple. Again, how does this end? I remember standing in Iraq early in the war. Now, we had just achieved what, in any conventional sense, looked like overwhelming success. The regime had fallen. This is, early spring of 2003. The military campaign had been quite decisive. The map, if you were looking at the map, looked relatively clean, as much as a war zone can. The victory, by every traditional measure, let me emphasize that, by every traditional measure, appeared within reach. And yet, standing there talking to commanders, walking through cities that were no longer governed, I had a very different realization. We had just won the war, supposedly so, and we had just lost control of what was to come next. That realization didn't come from theory, it came from something far more uncomfortable. The growing recognition that we had planned brilliantly for what in military circles we call phase three execution, major combat operations, but almost not at all for phase four, that stability and reconstruction, that transition towards reconstruction and stabilization. And what followed was not a failure of courage or capability. I have to emphasize that. It was not followed by a failure of courage or capability or even commitment. It was something entirely different. It was something else, something deeper, and frankly, something structural, flawed by design. We began to see a pattern: rapid operational success followed by strategic ambiguity, again, to put it kindly, followed by prolonged instability. And the hardest part, well, we didn't recognize it as a pattern. We treated each case as an exception. I saw it again in Afghanistan. Different terrain, different enemy, different politics, same pattern. Win the fight, but lose the frame. And over time, I came to believe something that I want to put in front of you today. Again, I want to try to do this in somewhat of a storytell. This phenomenon, this paradox, as I call it, is not a bug in the American or wider Western way of war. It's a feature. And again, it's a paradox. And now, here we are again, a different theater, a different adversary, but the same question returns. How does this end? Today, I want to suggest something to you. We're asking the wrong question, because the war we are entering, or perhaps already inside, is not a war that ends in the way we expect. This is the first thing we have to understand, at least in my perspective. This war will not stay put. It will not unfold in clean phases. It will not remain bounded to a geography. It will not culminate in a decisive battlefield outcome, because this is not a conventional war. It's what I call a compound contagion war. Not a war of territory, but a war of systems: energy systems, financial systems, alliance systems, information systems, domestic political systems. And here's the key: it doesn't spread through conquest, it spreads through diffusion. Now, let me show you what that actually looks like, not in theory, but in markets, because markets don't argue. They price reality before policies can even name it. Now, within days of initial strikes, Brent crude didn't just tick up, it surged past $80, then 100, then spiked above $126 per barrel. And even after the spike, it settled somewhere so far around $112, the highest level since 2022. Folks, that's not volatility. That's a system repricing the duration of conflict. Goldman Sachs estimates that traders are now building in roughly around a $14 per barrel risk premium. That's equivalent to pricing in a full month of disrupted Hormuz flows. Think about that. The market is not asking if disruption happens, it's asking how long does it last. Let me put it plainly. If you're looking for the decisive battle, you're already behind. I think this is a central problem. We're diagnosing a distributed conflict with a linear framework. Now, on the slide you're looking at behind me, on the left side, our model is bounded, linear, decisive, but on the right side, the reality. The situation is distributed, it's persistent, it's politically recursive. And at the center, we find the core error, believing that tactical success equals strategic control. It doesn't. It never has. And in this type of war, this compound war, it fails faster. This is what diffusion looks like. It's not expansion, it's propagation. A strike here produces effects there, military to economic, economic to the political, political to the domestic, domestic into the strategic. The blast radius is not physical, it's structural, and the boundary between foreign and domestic does not exist. Now, let me walk through this a bit further. I think, and this is where the foresighting and the forecasting comes in. Bear with me. First 3 months, I think everything looks pretty manageable. From a military perspective, we end up continuing to dominate. From a market perspective, volatility, but still functionality. From a maritime perspective, contested, but still semi-open. And here's where the illusion becomes dangerous because while we see control, markets are already telling a different story. Equities have now fallen for 4 consecutive weeks. The S&P 500 hitting new lows. The Russell 2000 down over 10% in correction territory, folks. But here's the key. This is not panic selling, it's duration pricing. Investors initially believed this would be a short, contained conflict. That belief is now gone. Now the market is asking a different question. Not does this escalate, but rather, how long does this last and what does it break? Conclusion? Success. But beneath that, something else is happening. Alliance strain begins. Partners start recalculating risk. Markets begin adapting, quietly embedding new realities. And legitimacy, well, it begins to drift. Here's that paradox again. We look most successful at the moment we are losing strategic position. Iran understands something we often miss. It doesn't need to close the strait. It just needs to make access conditional. And here's where this becomes even more consequential because oil is only half the story. Let's look at LNG. Natural gas is where the real shock begins. After the strike environment escalated, LNG prices didn't rise 10% or 20%, they rose nearly 60%. Qatar, responsible for 20% of global LNG supply, declared force majeure after drone disruptions. Spot prices in Asia doubled to over $25 per MMBTU in a matter of mere days. Let me translate that. Oil shocks are disruptive. Simultaneous oil and gas shocks, those are systems shaping. And here's the deeper point. Unlike oil, gas markets are less flexible, less fungible, and harder to reroute. So when Iran turns access and the leverage into a toll booth leverage, if you will, it's not just raising prices, it's reordering dependency. This is not blockade, it's actually discrimination. Some ships will move freely. Others are going to experience friction. Some states will pass and be allowed to pass smoothly. Others will be forced to pay a toll, pay a price. And over time, risk no longer is uniform. It becomes politically aligned and politically assigned. All right? That changes everything, folks. Insurance models, supply chains, alliance behavior. And here's the strategic inversion. Power is no longer about denial. It's about controlling access. I'm going to call this next section phase 2, systemic diffusion. Now, by around the 6 month mark, here's what I foresee and forecast. The war is spread. We're already seeing this happen now, right? These are not linear sequential phasings. These are semi-simultaneous phasings and stagings of a campaign gone automatic, if you will, up the escalation ladder. Again, this war is spread by this point, not geographically, but again, systemically. Proxy networks expanding. regional instability becoming more and more persistent, no longer episodic. Economic pressure transmits globally. Alliances begin to decouple. And here's the key insight, at least as I see it. No one action causes this. It's cumulative. This is not escalation, it's diffusion under pressure. And the most revealing signal, what might that be? Well, I think it's coming from the bonds and the bond market. Normally in crises, stocks fall, but bonds rise. But right now, both are falling. The U.S. 10-year yield has climbed to around 4.39%. The UK 10 years above around 4.9% levels not seen since 2008. And we all know that marker year. That combination has a name. It's called stagflation. And it creates a trap because central banks can no longer respond cleanly. They can't cut rates to support growth because inflation is accelerating. So now policy is no longer stabilizing the entire system. It's constrained by it. And now the paradox deepens. We remain militarily dominant, unquestionably so. But strategically, we're increasingly constrained. This is the same paradox I saw in Iraq, the same paradox I saw in Afghanistan. Only now it's happening at a global scale. Let's go into what I'll call phase three of this foresight and forecast, the domestic cascade. This is where it becomes unavoidable. The war comes home to all the home fronts, not through invasion, not through attack, but through translation. Economic pressure becomes political acceleration. Energy prices accelerate voter behavior. Supply chains accelerate campaign narratives. Not only accelerate, but alter, right? Information fragmentation accelerates, not to persuade, but to divide. And here's the most important line, at least on this slide before you. The war becomes domestic through the wallet. And this is where the compound security dilemma becomes very visible at the kitchen table, at the gas pump. Because what begins as a maritime disruption, and particularly one in all the over there places, becomes an energy shock, which becomes an inflation problem, which becomes a political issue, which becomes a strategic constraint. This is not, again, this is not escalation. This is translation across systems. And once that translation begins, you can't isolate the war from the society or the societies fighting it. At this point, you're no longer fighting a foreign war. You're managing a domestic system under stress. And then the system begins to feed on itself. Let me show you how tight this loop has become. A strong US dollar rising nearly 1% in a single day is making American LNG exports more expensive at precisely the moment global demand is spiking. So now our strength in one domain becomes a constraint in another. This is the essence of compound security. Every advantage carries a cost somewhere else. Economic pressure yields political fracture. Political fracture calls for retrenchment. Retrenchment yields and leads to more and more allied hedging. Allied hedging yields and leads to greater strategic pressure. And around it goes until you arrive at a place where you still have power, or rather force, but you have less freedom to use it. Now, if this isn't bad enough, let's start to layer on top of this some nonlinear shocks. And here's why this matters. Because in a system this tightly coupled, shocks don't scale linearly. They scale exponentially. Capital economics estimates that if disruption persists, oil could average $150 per barrel over the next 6 months. That would not just be a crisis, that would be the largest supply shock in modern economic history. A carrier strike, a failed operation, a mass casualty event, a maritime crisis, each one, and again, a maritime crisis not at just one choke point, littoral choke point, but two, maybe all 14 semi-simultaneously. Again, we should take the Islamic Republic of Iran at its word several months ago, frankly, over a year ago, in the rhetorical declaration of a rising organizing axis of resistance, right? And we on the West call that an axis of disruption, but perspective matters here, right? We may be already in the beginning of a long war, a long compound war. We're actually seeing or need to begin to see this axis, this rhetorical axis of resistance becoming more and more pragmatically real in terms of impacts at the global scale that translates directly to the kitchen table and to the household level. Each one of these black swans, they don't just escalate the war, they redefine it. They bring that compoundedness to it. Because in a connected system, shocks don't stay local. They again, they cascade and they compound. So, how does this end? Right? It doesn't end in victory, not as we've come to know it. It doesn't end in surrender either. It ends in transformation, some type of transformation that we're already in the early stages of. Markets are already signaling this outcome. There are only two scenarios being priced right now: a rapid de-escalation with oil collapsing back to around $65 a barrel. And that's going to be a long business lag. Again, as a lot of the oil and risk assessors in the oil and petroleum markets like to call it, oil rises like a rocket, right, under shocks. But then post shock, it floats back down to pre-shock factors like a feather, right? So that's one, a rapid de-escalation, oil collapsing back to around or floating back like a feather back around $65. Something that's not going to happen by the summer rush, right? Certainly not by then. Or secondly, a prolonged disruption with oil stabilizing maybe around and above $130 a barrel. Notice what's missing though. There's no middle, right? That's that's what deep uncertainty looks like, folks. Binary futures, fat tails on the risk spectrum, and very little confidence in control. A new equilibrium, less stable, more fragmented, more risk driven, more compound risk driven. And the most important line, perhaps this: the war will not end in victory. Again, not as we have come to know it. It will end in a system shaped by risk, compound risk, not rules. Now, again, I've said this before and I'll say it again. This is a paradox. The United States can win every tactical engagement. And again, I focus a lot of my work on the United States of America, but the United States of America, this paradox of within the American way of war or peace and warfare, but I think it also is a much more subversive and sinister paradox across the broader so-called Western way and Western ways. But again, the United States more pointedly can win every tactical engagement. Certainly so. We prove it time and time again. And still experience grand strategic displacement. We win the fight, we lose the frame. Rapid success leading to more and more ambiguity, which leads more and more to greater levels and types and scopes and scales of instability. The danger, again, is not failure. The danger is success, a success that we end up misreading time and time again. So let's go back again. How does this end? It ends the way Iraq ended, the way Afghanistan ended, not with a moment, but with a new condition, not with closure, but with some form of forced adaptation. And I'll leave you this perhaps, or begin to leave you with this final provocation, that the real question is not how do we win? The real question is, do we understand the type of war we're in the first place? Because if we don't, we will do what we have done before in all the prior cases. We will win early. We will misread that success. We will extend beyond our strategic grasp. And we will once again, find ourselves asking, too late, how did this happen? So when we ask, how does this end? Have already given us an answer. It doesn't end necessarily at all. It certainly doesn't end cleanly. It doesn't end decisively. It evolves into a system where risk replaces predictability, cost replaces control, and power operates under constraint. And if we fail to see that, we will once again confuse early success with strategic advantage. Let me leave you with this. The warning signs are not hidden, they're visible, unusually visible. The diffusion, the alliance strain, the domestic feedback loops, the weaponization of access. We've seen all these before. What is different now is their convergence. So the question is not whether this war will follow a familiar pattern. The question is and needs to be, will we recognize the pattern early enough to actually change it? Or once again, will we only understand it after the system has already shifted and the costs have already compounded? Folks, thank you very much again for your attention and for your hearing. Thanks for this opportunity to offer another dispatch from this side of the pond from the United States. And until next time, cheers.